Hello, and welcome to Fake News, a Pandemic, and a Presidential Election with Bexley Public Library. Thank you for tuning in. My name is Jeff Laser, and I'm an adult services librarian. And a few words about our speaker this evening. So today we are joined by Dr. Kelly Garrett. So he will be discussing finding reliable information during times of crisis. So Dr. Garrett is a professor in the School of Communication at The Ohio State University. His research concerns online political communication, online news, and the ways in which citizens and activists use new technologies to shape their engagement with contentious political topics. His most recent work, which is supported by an NSF Career Award, focuses on how people's exposure to and perceptions of online political information are related to their political beliefs. His work has been published in a number of outlets, including the Journal of Communication, Human Communication Research, Political Behavior, and the Journal of Computer-Mediated Communication, and more. So thank you so much, Dr. Garrett, for being here this evening, and I'll let you take it from here.
Thank you so much, Jeff, and good evening to everyone. I know Jeff gave very clear instructions about how you can email him with questions during the talk, but I would also add that given that this is a fairly small crowd, I'm more than happy to take your questions as the talk progresses. There's no reason to wait until the very end. In fact, I just assume with a crowd of this size, have this be a conversation. So I'll just say a couple more words about myself before I talk about the subject of that we're here tonight to discuss. As Jeff mentioned, I've done quite a bit of work related to misinformation and people's perceptions about the political world. So just to give you a range of the kinds of things that I've looked at, some of my work concerns the ways that people are influenced by the technologies they use. For example, are people who rely on social media more inclined to believe falsehoods than those who don't? I've also done work looking at what makes corrections more or less effective, whether it's possible to flag falsehoods and basically warn people off of them before they are affected by these claims. I've looked at how a variety of psychological factors shape whether people are persuaded by misinformation, everything from being excluded by your social group to being holding epistemic beliefs about how you know the world and how all these different factors can shape what you believe. So that's a little bit about me, but let's just jump right into the topic. I should say one other thing. I see many of you have cameras and you flip them off, perhaps out of respect or perhaps because you want your privacy. But if you turn your cameras on, then I can see what you're doing and gauge your reactions and see if people have questions. So feel free to turn the cameras on. I will be asking questions of you in a variety of ways, and so you'll have some chances to interact, but cameras always help. All right, so I expect back in 2016, many of you saw headlines about the prevalence of misinformation during the election. So the slide that I'm showing here, this is an image that came from BuzzFeed. And sorry, I see. Okay, so someone has just mentioned that the Facebook stream is still not working. We appreciate the heads up. I think that the tech folks are working on trying to get it to go. So BuzzFeed had this graphic, and the point of the graphic was simply that engagement with inaccurate claims on Facebook was huge. A lot of people were sharing, commenting on, liking stories that were fictional, that were posted on sources that weren't real news sources and that contained clear fabrications. So the impression, I think, that many people had in the immediate aftermath of the 2016 election is that fake news was pretty much everywhere, that we were totally surrounded by fake news. I'm going to come back to that, but for a moment, I want to talk instead about where we are today. So there's certainly some fake news out there. I'm showing you a headline that circulated just a couple weeks ago. But I'm curious, before I say anything more, I'm going to send a poll out your way. You should all see an opportunity to answer a couple quick questions here. I'm wondering whether you have seen any false or misleading political news stories. in the last week? How many, if so? And also, whether your impression is that true stories are getting more coverage, more attention on social media, or false stories, or if you think they're getting about the same amount of attention. All right, so I've got, oh, here we are. We got several people have weighed in. Let's see if I can, well, I'll just tell you, it's not that hard to explain. So what people have said is, you got the full gamut here. We've got some people who said they haven't seen any. One person said they saw a few, one saw 3 to 5, one saw more than 5. And it looks like people are equally split as to whether true or false stories are getting more attention. So we're in the middle of a study right now. We are collecting data about the kinds of news stories that are being shared on social media, especially on Facebook. Which ones are getting the most attention? And we're classifying them in terms of their accuracy. The ones that make political claims, are they true or false? And this is just one snapshot of a 2-week period earlier this month. You see 10 headlines. These are the top 10 most engaging news topics, news stories in those 2-week period. The green stories are true, the yellow ones are false. And the height of the bar shows you how much these stories have been shared. The takeaway is that there's a whole lot more highly engaging true stuff than there is highly engaging false stuff. And furthermore, the claims that are true are getting a lot more attention. There are a few claims that are just running away with the attention. The claim, the story in The Atlantic about Trump insulting members of the military was engaged, on the order of 7 million times over at the point that we conducted this study. And that was dwarfing anything else. So this is consistent with other data we've collected. We did a similar study that lasted for 6 months, where we were checking checking what was being shared every 2 weeks for 6 months, and we saw a very similar pattern. In general, truths get a lot more attention, and there are a lot more of them. Now, another way you might think about this is that it's not just the one headline that's true or false that gets a lot of attention, but for every headline that's true and gets a lot of attention, there are actually a lot of other stories about that same headline that also get attention. And so we looked at the top 5,000 most engaging stories and said, well, how much attention are those getting? And we find that, again, when you look at all of the stories that people are talking about, true stories are getting a whole lot more attention. They have much bigger audiences than false stories. Another part of the work that we've been doing, and this is referring back to the study in 2019, is to try and understand how often people are influenced by these false claims. So it's one thing to know that truths are shared more often than false, but it's entirely different to say, well, yeah, but are people fooled by them? How often do people get claims right, and do they get them wrong? So in 2019, over the course of 6 months, we talked to people a dozen times every couple weeks, and we would ask them about these most engaging false stories that were out there, and also the most engaging true stories, 10 of each. And we asked them, is this true or not? And when we look at the results, we find that in general, people did pretty well at recognizing true stories when they saw them. Each one of these columns, the green columns, are the accuracy of the true statements. So 75% of the time, people said the true statements were true, which is really pretty good. We have a less encouraging story when we look at falsehoods. People are more likely to say that falsehoods are true. But if you notice, it's about 50-50. In other words, with falsehoods, people were basically guessing. That's not particularly surprising, because we weren't actually testing whether people had seen these claims before. We were just saying, well, here's a claim. You may or may not have heard it. What do you think? Is it true? Well, if you've never heard it, if you don't have any evidence for it, you're going to guess. When you look at the data a little more closely, you say, well, was it definitely true? Because those are the ones we should be really worried about. Definitely true. When someone says a falsehood is definitely true, then they feel like they have good evidence. They really know that this is something they should believe. And only 10% of the claims were labeled as definitely true when they were false. So this was quite infrequent. In other words, in general, Americans do pretty well at distinguishing between truths and falsehoods. We aren't perfect. We don't know every true claim that's out there. We don't recognize every falsehood, but there is not a crisis of people's ability to tell what's true and what's not. So I want to take a minute before moving on to what you can do about it when you encounter these falsehoods. I want to take a moment to talk about who seems to be most susceptible. And I'm going to focus on one topic that's gotten quite a lot of attention. So I've sent out another poll. I'm just curious if you have any intuitions about who you think is more susceptible to falsehoods. Young people or people who are older? I realize that's pretty blunt. Let's make the cutoff, I don't know, say 45. If you're over 45, are you going to be more likely to be accurate or less likely to be accurate than if you're under 45? All right, so the most popular answer is that the older folks tend to do worse, which is very consistent with what the reporting on this topic has been recently. However, the reporting that you've seen out there is based predominantly on how people have interacted with the content. When we actually surveyed people about their belief accuracy, not what did they look at on social media, what did they like or comment on, but what did they themselves believe, we found that the older you were, the more likely you were to get the questions right. You were more likely to be able to discriminate between claims that were true and claims that were false. And it's not just our data that show this. There's been some work looking at people's perceptions about COVID-19 and specifically about their misperceptions about COVID-19. And we find that young people are more likely to embrace a variety of false claims that have been made about the disease. Now, there are a bunch of ways that we could explain this. Maybe it's about the wisdom that comes with age. Maybe it's about being more careful. Maybe it's about the fact that in the case of COVID, it is true that young people are less in jeopardy. They are less often affected in severe ways by this disease. And so maybe they're just paying less attention to the news. As I mentioned, the fact that younger people have performed a little less well in terms of their ability to discriminate truths and falsehoods is counteracted by the fact that in the 2016 election, we saw that older people were much more likely to have shared false content. And this is a somewhat puzzling phenomenon. It could mean that older folks are sharing content with comments saying, this isn't true. We just don't know because we don't have that level of detail about the data that we have. All we can see right now is that folks who are older have been engaging with it more often. Another factor that influences people's ability to tell what's true and what's not is happily education. The more education you have, the better you tend to do. This isn't particularly surprising, but it should, if nothing else, convince you that our data is trustworthy. Something that I've paid particular interest to is the idea that some people believe that they can tell what's true and what's not using their intuition. They can follow their gut. They just feel when something's true and when it's not. And they'll tell you that on a survey. We find that people who tend to believe that their intuition will lead them to the truth tend to do significantly worse when it comes to actually telling what's true from what's false. Again, maybe that's not surprising, but the size of the effect is pretty impressive to me. I mean, they're doing 5% worse. That's as much as going from having just a little bit of college to having a PhD, right? So trusting your gut when trying to decide what's true generally is not a great idea. All right, so perhaps the reason that all of you are here tonight is that you're looking for some guidance, some thoughts about what it is that you can do to protect yourself and perhaps to help protect the people that you know from the influence of misinformation, to help you avoid being tricked by the kinds of falsehoods that are circulating most often. And in order to talk about that, I actually want to distinguish between three different kinds of falsehoods. One of the most widely spread, most engaging sorts of falsehoods that we are seeing today is political satire. Now, you might say, well, that can't do any harm, right? It's a joke. Obviously, satire is humor. People don't mistake jokes for truth. Let me say more about that. I'm going to put a pin in it for a minute just to point out the other kinds of misinformation that we'll talk about are the more intentional manipulation or taking of messages out of context with a seeming intent to deceive, or sometimes not intentionally, but inadvertently, news organizations produce headlines that, taken without careful consideration, could be misleading. I'll talk a little bit about how you guard against those kinds of problems. And finally, conspiracy theories. I'll give you a definition of what I mean by conspiracy theories, and we'll talk a little bit about how you respond to those. Because each of these three sources of misperceptions, they're quite different ways that. All right, so satire. Here's a very popular satirical news story. It was shared, I think, hundreds of thousands, several hundreds of thousands of times as of a couple weeks ago. The story, if you were on social media, if you were on Facebook, this is what you would have seen. This picture here, it's a picture of LeBron James and one of his teammates wearing a lace collar in honor of the late Supreme Court Justice Ginsburg. Or perhaps you prefer The Onion. The Onion posted the story, "Trump pledges to call for violence regardless of the election's outcome." Now, perhaps it's obvious to you that these are both jokes. No NBA players wore frilly lace collars, and The Onion, well, no legitimate news organization said anything about Trump pledging to call for violence. And yet, when you go on social media, you find people talking about these very posts, sharing them with their friends, saying, yeah, this is why I love LeBron, or I wish this organization would stop promoting these terrible ideas. So my point is simply that in an environment like social media, where you're seeing a whole lot of content out of context, how much attention are you spending on any one headline? The data that we have says that most people spend about 6 seconds evaluating a headline before they scroll on, and that's the stuff they're interested in. If you're trying to make a judgment about whether a claim is true in 6 seconds, something that looks kind of like a news headline, it's got a picture, it's got a phrase at the top that looks like something that a news headline might read. I should point out, by the way, people think that a story is more likely to be true if there's a picture next to it than if it doesn't have a picture next to it. So when you're using these sort of intuition, these sort of rules of thumb, you look at these things and say, well, they look like news. And you might think they're kind of funny or kind of shocking, or maybe they make you angry. And so before you do anything to check it, you just share it, you send it along. So what do you do to protect against these kinds of mistakes? I mean, perhaps it's self-evident, but news organizations and satirical news organizations are both pretty good about self-identifying. Satire sites are not in the business of tricking people. If you go to the page that says "About Us," they will tell you in unambiguous terms, yeah, we're satire. The Babylon Bee goes on at length about how satirical they are, and is a little bit upset that their stories occasionally get fact-checked by Snopes, because users of the fact-checking site send messages into Snopes saying, I don't know, is this true? And so Snopes has gone into the business of saying, no, there's no claim, there's nothing here that's true. This is something that was published as satire. So you can wait for someone else to do it, or you can do it yourself. If you see someone share something that's false on Facebook, one of these satirical stories, it's tempting to say, how could you be so foolish? That's dumb. But, don't you know that's a joke? But, it's actually much more effective to very nicely say, oh, that's actually from The Onion, which is a satirical site, or that's actually from the Babylon Bee. If it helps, you can include a link to Snopes. Turns out that we have good evidence that when someone posts something to Facebook and says, hey, you know what? That's actually not true, people change their behavior. So you may have tried this, and maybe it wasn't very gratifying because the person who you corrected got a little upset at you or said, yeah, no, Snopes is wrong, I'm right. But when you look across all users, you find that false stories tend to see rapidly increasing engagement right up until the point that someone says, oh, Snopes looked into that and they found it's false. And the moment that happens, traffic drops. So it may seem obvious, but it actually can make a huge difference, right? The drop in traffic that we're talking about here translates into potentially millions of people seeing and perhaps being persuaded, because when a story that's satirical is shared the first time, the first person probably knew it was coming from a satirical site, but every time someone else comments on it, it adds a layer of legitimacy. The original site becomes more distant, and we tend to think more about the proximal source, the person who shared it with us. Well, that person wouldn't have shared something false, so I'm going to trust that they did their homework. Now let's talk about the second kind of, the second source of misperception. These are the sometimes intentional, sometimes accidental sharing of claims without context. So, for example, on Twitter, a user recently posted this: Joe Biden completely botches the Pledge of Allegiance. He said, I pledge allegiance to the United States of America, one nation, indivisible, under God, for real. It's consistent with claims that the vice president is not as cognitively coherent as he once was, and certainly people were attracted to this claim. But if you actually looked at the video in the immediate, like just seconds before he said that, this is the full quote. He wasn't trying to recite the Pledge of Allegiance. He was actually making a larger point about how he wasn't pledging allegiance to conservative states or to liberal states. He was pledging allegiance to the entire country. Whether you agree with him or disagree with him, whether you think he's a good candidate or a bad candidate, the assertion that he was attempting to recite the Pledge of Allegiance and failed to do so accurately is a blatant falsehood. All right, so hopefully I've convinced you that this is the kind of claim that you want to avoid endorsing or promoting or sharing. So what can you do to help protect yourself? 2 suggestions. The first is to actually think a little bit about the context. And the second is to remember that you and me and every human being is biased, and be aware and on the lookout for those biases. And I'll give you a few sort of red flags to watch out for. But first, what do I mean by looking for context? My suggestion to all of you is that if you think a news story is worth sharing, I would argue that it is also worth checking before you share it. So first of all, we know a lot of people share stories without ever clicking through. If you do that, you will never know if the story is a satire or patently taken out of context or highly partisan. It's important to click through and look at the story. And I would argue it's not enough to look at that one story. Again, if you think a claim is important enough that other people should know about it, it should also matter whether that claim is right. So take the extra minute, do a search, see what other news organizations are saying about it. You should find that a variety of news organizations are talking about this story. And ideally, these organizations won't all be of the same sort. You don't want a bunch of liberal sites all saying this is true and no one else talking about it, or a bunch of conservative sites all saying it's true with no one else talking about it. What you want to see is that the major newspapers of record or the major news organizations have weighed in and they said, yeah, this is true. Or some partisan sites on both sides have weighed in, or fact checkers have weighed in. There's no one right solution, but what we're looking for is a breadth of sources. People are sometimes tempted to say, well, I'm just going to read the one story really carefully, and that will let me figure out whether it's true or not. Turns out it's really hard to decide whether a claim is true or not by looking at that one claim carefully. You do much better by reading broadly than you do by reading deeply into a single piece. The other part of this, which I mentioned, is that you should be aware that you are biased. And this is intended not to say that you shouldn't engage in critical thinking, but to remember how we all engage in critical thinking. We engage critical thinking when we see a claim that we are suspicious of. If we see a claim that contradicts something that we believe is true, a claim that makes something we believe look bad, someone we like look unlikable, then we vet that claim really carefully. But when we see a claim that affirms something we already believe, shows us just how great a guy our candidate is, shows us that that thing that we believe, well, here's just one more piece of evidence that it's true, we don't vet that. We completely disregard our critical thinking skills, and we simply accept it. It's not a critique of any one person, it's in our nature. But the thing is, human beings are very flexible. We can learn to do better than our nature, right? We can learn to make a point, to check our biases, to recognize, oh, that's something I really want to be true, but maybe I should let's look one more time and make sure before I share it. So what are some of the red flags that you can look for? When you see a headline and you're like, oh, that's got to be true, that makes me so mad, that's a warning sign. Emotion blinds us to our biases. When we are angry, we are much more likely to fall in line with our party than we are to pay attention to the evidence, for example. Do you feel a burning need to share something? Everyone has to know about this right now. That is precisely the time not to tell everyone about it right now. When you feel that burning desire to get the word out, that is when you should say, okay, something's up. I am too invested in this. I better just make sure that it's not my personal bias that's leading me to want to share this with everyone. If you're getting ready to share it and you think to yourself, yeah, I want to say this is from fill in the blank. And you're like, wait, I don't know who this is from. Or, yeah, I can see the name of it right there, but Babylon Bee, I don't know who they are. I've never bumped into them before. Maybe I should just go and see, is this a real news source? How long have they been around? And think about the evidence. Can you explain? So the headline says this person has been accused of this terrible thing. Great. Maybe that's an important headline to share. But would you tell a family member that it's true if you didn't know the evidence? Would you accept the claim from someone else if they couldn't explain to you why they believed it's true? No, of course not. So make sure that you can explain to yourself, you can summarize simply what the evidence is. This is not foolproof. I'm not promising that you'll never make a mistake, but these little things help. Now, the last thing that I want to talk about hang on a sec. The last thing I want to talk about is conspiracy theories. And I have a quick question. Actually, let me get a quick poll before I move on from that topic. So be honest, I'd like to know if you've ever shared a news story without clicking through, or if you ever shared something that you later learned that it wasn't true. And I'm curious how often right now you'd say you regularly verify by using some other source before you share something. These are anonymous, by the way. I won't be telling anyone what you said. Just going to take one more minute to let people weigh in. Okay, so I'm not going to tell you anything specific, but I will say, that people are admitting that, at least occasionally, they've shared stuff without clicking through. They've shared something that they later realized wasn't right. And that they aren't always checking stories before they share them. This is totally normal, right? That you shouldn't feel bad about it. My point is simply that there is a great opportunity to do even better as you move forward. All right, so now, so that I have a sense of what your prior experiences are, I'm curious how many of you have encountered what you would describe as a conspiracy theory. And up on the screen, I've got two things. I've got an example of someone who's endorsing a conspiracy theory, and I've got a little definition of, or a sort of a flow chart for how you can distinguish conspiracy thinking from conventional or non-conspiratorial thinking. So a conspiracy theory, right? Conspiracy theories are sometimes true. Sometimes there is a conspiracy to do harm. Sometimes there is a powerful, small, elite group of people working in secret to shape a political landscape. That happens, but it doesn't happen very often. And conspiratorial thinking is someone who has this overriding suspicion of all claims that politics are always about conspiracy. There's always cloak and dagger. There's always someone behind the curtain pulling the strings. A tendency to overinterpret the evidence. So you find one little piece of evidence and you say, well, that means that all this other stuff must be true. Conspiracy theory is one of the more straightforward ways of recognizing conspiracy theories is that they are often laced with contradictions. Not that the conspiracy theorist is going to say, well, this and this are both true at the same time, but that if you follow the stream of logic, you will eventually find that this point here contradicted something that was one of the early premises here. And in the end, you have these claims that can seem quite outlandish. Claims that vaccines are going to be distributed that have microchips in them, or that cell phone towers are the reason that we have COVID-19. These are clearly, patently, unambiguously false, right? So by the way, everyone who answered said that they've seen conspiracy theories before. And I don't know about you, but I will admit that I find responding to conspiracy theories to be a test of my abilities to be effective, right? Because people who are engaged in conspiracy thinking are generally not hugely responsive. They don't generally take correction very well. They often get upset, angry, dismiss you as one of the evildoers. But I want to suggest that despite all of that, reaching out, trying to offer gentle corrections is still useful. Because maybe your message won't get through, but if enough people do it, individuals do often respond to a critical mass of corrections. One correction isn't enough, but if everyone they know is saying, no, that's not right, people are more likely to reconsider. And it's not just telling people that they're wrong, but trying to do so with empathy. Because one of the things that we've learned about conspiracy thinking is that the people who engage in it are often the ones who feel most powerless, the ones who feel most fearful. This seeking a conspiratorial explanation for all the powerful things happening to them reflects a sense of being out of control, of having no say over the world and over their lives. And, that's got to be a very scary way of living in the world. If you feel you have no control over the world, if you feel that everything you do is being shaped by others, you can see why you might want to be able to blame it on a powerful cabal of people working against you. So with all of that in mind, I would encourage you to try and avoid ridicule, as tempting as it may be. Like, I will admit that when a family member shares for the 18th time the story about how COVID is made up and masks are stupid, I sometimes just want to yell, because I also know that COVID is not made up and that masks save lives, and we have 200,000 people in this country who have died because of the disease. And it's hard for me to keep my temper. But it's still important to try and show empathy to the people who are making these claims, because it reflects a problem that they are facing personally. There are a variety of ways that you can try and counteract conspiracy thinking. You could try facts. Sometimes people will be responsive to it, but maybe not. But you know what? You can also try talking to people about the sources that they're relying on. Have you noticed that all the places making these claims about how the solution to COVID is this miracle drug, they're all places that sell that miracle drug that make the claim? You can try just focusing on being empathetic. I understand this is really a scary time. Yes, this is really frustrating. There are some terrible things that have happened in the past, right? And you can try and take the argument apart logically. Again, I don't want to give you the impression that you're going to persuade someone who has endorsed a conspiracy theory to change their mind. Not on the first try, and maybe, probably, not ever. But I want to remind you that the number of people who believe conspiracy theories is quite small. And if you can help slow the spread, keep that number from growing, then you're doing an important service. All right, so those are the comments that I had prepared, and now I would be delighted to take whatever questions you might have.
Okay, well, thank you, Dr. Garrett, so much. And we do want to encourage anyone who wants to. We're going to start out with a few questions that we gathered during your presentation. And then I just wanted to really quick apologize. We don't know why Facebook doesn't want us to live stream anymore. So we're going to figure out a different solution to that going forward. And so I will share my screen here. Unless, Jeff, do you have the questions ready?
I do, yeah.
Okay.
Would you like me to share it?
Yes, please.
Okay.
Thanks.
1 second. Can you see them?
Yes.
Okay, excellent. Okay, so our first question here. So do you think, given how there is a system set up to reward news articles that elicit an emotional response, engagement or clicks on social media, driving ad revenue, that type of thing, that the quality of information being shared is generally worse than the pre-social media era?
So this is a very complicated and hard to answer empirically kind of question. So I'm going to share a few thoughts. On the one hand, we know that false claims are getting more attention than they could possibly have. Sorry, there was a comment that distracted me. They're getting more attention than they possibly could have had in a pre-social media environment. So a false claim that's getting 1 million or 1.5 million engagements is not something that could have happened prior to the existence of social media. So from that angle, you could say, yeah, there are some claims that are just getting more traction than they would have otherwise. But you know what? There's also a whole lot more accurate information out there than there was prior to social media. And in fact, some work that I've done has shown that people who use social media generally, for example, in 2016, people who used Facebook more often were more accurate about a handful of high-profile political misinformation claims than people who used Facebook less often. So, it's not cut and dry. So it's easy to point to anecdotes and say, yeah, we see these examples of fake news being spread very widely on social media. And I'm not denying that happens, and I'm not saying it's not a problem. But I would say that there is the good and the bad. Fake news and real news are being spread across social media. And I would also point out that false claims are not solely shared on social media. The president has been shown to make false claims with some regularity, and his false claims are repeated in the news media, often with correction, but still, claims that aren't true are getting huge exposure that dwarfs the 1, 2, 10, 14 million kinds of engagements that we're seeing on social media. The exposure that you get from having one newscast on CNN or Fox or MSNBC dwarfs all of the social media stuff. TV is a much larger audience and in many ways a much more influential medium still. So I realize I'm hedging a little bit, but that's how I would answer that question.
Thank you. Yeah. I figured it would be not a clear-cut response because there's a lot of factors there. Excellent point though about television and how that plays into it as well. So our next one here. So can you talk a little bit about the limits of both sides' arguments and maybe give some examples of when they're might be unnecessary or even dangerous?
Yeah, so you'll sometimes hear people refer to something. So both sides' arguments is also sometimes referred to as false equivalence. So journalists have a long-standing standard of trying to make sure that both sides are represented in their news coverage. The problem with this standard, so it's a very useful standard, right? You want to make sure that the majority opinion does not appear to be the only opinion. You want to make sure that, because sometimes the minority is right. Sometimes the minority view is insightful and is the direction in which the society needs to move, right? So you want to make sure that the minority view is heard. However, that can be exploited. So in the case of climate change, for example, the vast majority, 95 or 97+% of climate scientists agree that climate change is happening and that human activity is responsible for that climate change. But the need to present both sides led for many years journalists to report, well, here's what climate scientists say, the people who believe in climate change, and here's what someone who doesn't believe in climate change believes. And because news coverage was providing basically equal time to both sides, the lay audience, who didn't realize that it was 97 people on one side and 3 on the other, were like, oh, well, there are these two sides and it could be either way and science isn't really clear, when really the science was unambiguous. It was overwhelmingly clear. We see this playing out all the time in the contemporary media environment. We regularly hear, if you search for basically any claim, you will find both sides, which is why it's important to pay attention to sources, to look for established sources, to make, sometimes these small sources do get a good scoop. But if these small, very partisan sources are the only people talking about it, you should look at it with a skeptical eye. So both sides' approaches can definitely be dangerous if they create the impression that the evidence for both sides is equal. It's a fine balance, right? Because you also don't want to exclude minority views entirely. Just because a view is in the minority does not mean it's inherently wrong.
Yeah, that's absolutely an excellent point. So again, a very sort of nuanced take on that. It's not necessarily about the numbers or the people that believe it. It's about, empirical evidence and whatnot. So yeah, and I did want to point out, Mark Allen shared a thread it's a Twitter link in the chat, so which relates to the both sides reaction to yesterday's debate. So I check that out. So yeah, let's move on to the next one. So if people are only reinforcing their initial biases with news from sources that affirm their biases, how do we stop that cycle?
Okay, so there are several things that I want to respond to first. This idea that people only look at news that affirms what they believe, sometimes this is called the echo chamber effect. Sometimes you hear people talk about, well, in academic circles, it's referred to as selective exposure. The echo chamber is actually dramatically overestimated. The fact is that although people are drawn to news that affirms their viewpoint, they rarely systematically avoid everything that challenges their view. So when you encounter someone who believes something that you don't, it is probably not because they've never seen the other side. It's not that people have isolated themselves from the facts and they're living in this little tiny bubble and they only ever hear reinforcing messages. Rather, it's that people are predisposed to trust the members of their in-group, the members of their tribe, over the members of the out-group, the members of the other tribe. And in American politics, parties are very tribal. Democrats and Republicans see the opposing parties as a different species. Since the 1960s, the attitudes that people have towards the other party have changed radically. Back in the 1960s, Americans in general said the members of the other party, they weren't quite as good as us. They weren't quite as smart as us. Now, across the board, Americans generally agree that members of the other party are downright evil. They are intent on destroying America, and they want me personally, as a member of the party they oppose, to be hurt, to be injured. One of the more striking illustrations of the animosity that we feel, people are more concerned about their child marrying a member of the party that they oppose than they are about the child marrying someone from a different religion, a different race, a different background, right? So there is a great deal of animosity out there. And you can see how that could translate into beliefs, right? If you're hearing two arguments, but the people on your side are telling you this is true, those other guys are liars, seeing the evidence may not be that persuasive. So again, this is where I say the trick to defeating this is to start in your own house. Recognize when you yourself are engaging in this, my people said it, it must be true, they said it, it must be a lie, and instead try and pay careful attention to what the experts on the subject have to say. And there are experts, and they do matter. Like there are scientists who study the climate. There are public health scholars who do study pandemics. There are political scientists who do study authoritarianism. There are people who study the way misinformation flows. Turn to the experts and try and put faith in them. And it's hard to put faith in other people, especially in an environment where you know so many people are lying. But we have to. None of us knows enough to evaluate all the evidence for ourselves. It's simply not possible. I think I'm a smart guy. I am never going to know enough about climate science to judge for myself whether climate change is really happening. And I'm sorry, if you're not a climate scientist and you think you can, you are fooling yourself. So how do we do it? We accept that experts are the key. They are the ones who have the best tools. Does that make us susceptible, vulnerable to being exploited, taken advantage of? Well, yes, it does. But you know what? If you don't trust the experts, then you're susceptible to the other group. Whoever is telling you, don't believe the experts, believe us. You're susceptible to the possibility that they might be lying. And I happen to be a very strong believer in the power of science. It's an open model for trying to uncover what's true and correct our errors and help us learn. Science does pretty well in the long run at fixing mistakes. So that's the answer to me. Experts.
Sorry, my mic was off there. Yes, yeah, excellent response.
I would.
Sorry, Liam.
I was just going to say, I don't know, maybe I'm the only one in the group thinking this, but then my immediate response is just like, well, but what if they don't believe the experts? And so how do we, I guess, reinstate faith in the experts and in, I guess, in journalists? I don't know if this is maybe outside of it seems like your expertise is pretty broad. So but how do, it feels like so much faith has been lost in these institutions, which even, when I was a kid, we had a lot more faith in, even like the New York Times, or maybe that's not true, but it just feels like so much faith in the news media has been lost. And so how do we reinstate that, I guess? How do we get people to believe that journalists aren't out here trying to pull the wool over our eyes?
Okay, so there are a couple parts to the answer to this question. First, I'm going to share a little good news, so we're not all too depressed. Confidence in things like science still remains pretty high. Most Americans do trust scientists.
Can you show us the data on that?
I could, but I don't have it right in front of me.
Oh,
but you're absolutely right. Confidence in journalists has declined. It's interesting, though. Confidence in the journalists that you believe in, the journalists for your news organization, tends to be pretty high. It's only confidence in all those other journasts that's gone down.
Well, right, and I'm actually gonna interrupt you. Do you think that the confidence in the journalists has gone down because of the buyout of local news from 3 news companies?
I think that there is a lot going on in the decline in faith in journalism.
Okay.
Some of the answers include the rapid and expansive growth of a very heterogeneous news environment. So now any perspective you want to find, it's out there. And so you have news organizations that will say, you can always find evidence that this journal or that newspaper is covering something up, right? Because someone is willing to endorse that claim. That has also made it such that news organizations are willing to be more partisan, right? Back when there were the 3 big broadcast news networks that everyone tuned into, basically they all towed the line. They all told the same story. With the emergence of cable news and then internet news, you saw the emergence of more partisan outlets. And in response to the emergence of Fox, you see other outlets shifting in counter to Fox because Fox was being very effective at attracting an audience. And so now we have a news media landscape that has a lot more partisan entities. And it used to be, you'd say, well, Fox and MSNBC represent the outer bounds. Well, now they're in the middle compared to what's out there. The extremes are really extreme. So that's part of it. There's not a simple or quick solution for how we reinvigorate faith in journalists or other kinds of experts, say, for example, librarians. But I would suggest that one silver lining is that it is, with steady interventions, the system can correct itself because experts in the long run tend to be shown right. So journalists have been saying over the past 10 years, this is the case. This is what's going to happen. This is what's going to happen. If you don't act, this is going to happen. And if you look back at the evidence and someone says, well, you can't ever trust those journalists. Well, show them what the journalists were saying 10 years ago, 5 years ago, 2 years ago. You see, the journalists were saying this was going to be an issue, and now it's front and center. With the COVID stuff, I regularly say, well, you don't think that COVID public health scholars know what they're talking about? Back in February, they said, we could have 200,000 people die from this pandemic. And I remember seeing that number and thinking, God, I really hope they don't know what they're talking about, right? So in some ways, the world is helping provide the evidence we need to provide that logical argument for why people should trust the experts. Obviously, these arguments are not just about ration. Trust is a leap of faith. It's scary to put your faith in someone else about an important claim. But hopefully, if you can point to enough examples where people who have trusted the evidence have had good outcomes, you might see some progress in that way.
I'd like to go on with that question if I could and say, so I think the thing I often wonder about is how can we then find and identify those experts? Because if we rely on media or other things to point out an expert, it seems that anymore you can find an expert that will back up whatever your bias happens to be. So I find it more and more difficult over time to determine unbiased experts. How do we identify those?
So one part of the solution, so I would shy away from trying to find the experts yourself, because that is, as you've already figured out, really hard, right? Journalists struggle to try and find experts to talk to them about all these topics. And if you try and do it as a relatively lesser known quantity, you're going to have a hard time sort of identifying and connecting with these individuals. But you can do a variety of things to figure out if the news organization's experts, the experts identified by news organizations, are people that you can trust. Look, for example, at their credentials. So do they hold a relevant degree? Very often you'll see experts brought on because, well, this person is a doctor. Okay, a medical doctor or someone who holds a PhD, because those are very different things. And one is appropriate if you're talking about the effects of COVID on the body, and the other is more appropriate if you're talking about the pandemic and the spread of disease, right? Don't talk to a medical doctor who treats people to get advice about how diseases spread, how epidemics spread through a community. So pay attention to the degree. Look at the organization. Oh, sorry, another part of the degree. It's not just which degree, but in what field is the degree. So you can find someone who holds a PhD in engineering who is more than happy to talk about climate change. But you know what? Having a degree in engineering does not actually make you an expert on everything, right? Just like I have a degree in information, that does not actually mean that I know everything about all information, right? I know about a very tiny, narrow slice of stuff that happens to be really relevant right now. So think about that. Look at the affiliation of the individual. And here you have to be careful, right? Because in climate change, there, for example, there's a classic example. The Heartland Institute was a large think tank set up with a lot of research scientists affiliated with it who were always producing new research about how climate change isn't real. This is hard, right? Because it has all the markings of a legitimate organization. And I'd love to say, well, it's as easy as just follow the money. Look at who funds it. But the truth is that both sides tend to say, well, if you just follow the money, people who say that climate change isn't real will typically say, well, the scientists who say climate change is real are just doing it for the money. I happen to know some of the scientists who do this work. I'm pretty sure that they would not agree that the money is so great in the work that they do. But you're still going to have to use some shortcuts. You're going to have to use some heuristics. You're going to have to say, okay, this organization looks like a legitimate organization. Ideally, I would say, look for people affiliated with universities, because universities have been around for hundreds of years. And you can look and see if this is a reputable university. Yeah, Harvard and all the big public state universities, these are all well-known universities. And if an individual is affiliated with a university, has a degree in the right area, and it's the right kind of degree, they probably really have the expertise that you're looking for. Now, this stuff I'm talking about is most relevant in science claims, right? PhDs and MDs don't make sense for every kind of expertise. For fact checking, I tend to say, journalists at big name news organizations have a lot riding on getting the facts right? If they get the facts wrong, for the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal both have clear political orientations. When you look at the editorial board, you can see where they lie. But they also have a lot invested in not being blatantly partisan. in their news coverage, both of them. Because if they did that, if they lose the ability to claim a legitimate news organization status, then that's all they've got. That's why they make money. So big news organizations aren't perfect, but compared to the Daily Tweeter, I would say they're a good choice.